So what I've been doing so far is I've been making a case for how important literary history actually is, like how important culture actually is, and how important cultural critique can be, like being aware of the narratives and the words and so on can help you to understand the politics, or being aware of the culture can help you understand political judgments. What I want to move on to now is just a word about how you then address this, right? How you begin to talk about it. And one way that we'll be talking about it in this course is the very broad approach of colonial history, where one of the first things that you do if you're doing colonial history is you question the neutral claims of knowledge, right? You question whether the things that have been laid down might in some way have been laid down with an imperial spin, which then has to be queried, right? So if you're doing colonial history, you're taking for granted that the libraries have been organized the wrong way, right? Or at least I won't say wrong, but they've been organized a certain way. That even the language has been organized a certain way, so that you don't see some things that you might otherwise see. Now, these are arguments that many of you might be more familiar with in an American context, right? Where you would say that in American history, one has to be very careful because American history has been laid down in such a way that you might not see, for example, the history of enslaved people, right? That's probably a very familiar argument. But that's a generic anti-colonial argument that can be applied in lots of other settings around the world, including in Russia and in Ukraine. So in colonial history, you're asking yourself to question the apparent neutrality of knowledge, including the instruments of knowledge, languages, spellings, maps, library organizations. And you're also asking yourself, can people change halfway, right? So if these concepts have been laid down into us and we've accepted them as neutral, are we actually capable of catching ourselves halfway, which is a very important history question. Because if it's not possible, then we might as well give up on history, because we all have a lot of legends laid into us, imperial and otherwise. And getting to history is a matter of being able to say, well, maybe some of the things I'm committed to, maybe not, might not be correct. Okay, so I want one of you to figure out how many lecture classes there are in Ukraine on Ukrainian history right now in the U.S. Because I'm going to say one, and I want you guys to prove that there's another lecture class going on in Ukraine in the United States right now. I'm going to guess that, like, despite the fact that it's in the news and so on, I'm going to guess there's only one, right? And that's sort of that would be weird, wouldn't it? I mean, would you go that far with me? I'm going to say one, maybe two, right? Like full-on lecture classes that are just about Ukraine. Not classes where somebody mentions Ukraine, right, or Ukrainian poem is assigned, but a full-on class about Ukraine in our country of 300 million people, in our fantastic higher educational system. I'm going to go with one, and I'm going to be surprised if it's more than two. So somebody figure that out by next class, because it's an example of what I'm talking about with the institutions, right? Because no one would disagree now with the proposition that something important is going on in Ukraine. If something important is going on in Ukraine, that means something important could go on in Ukraine. If something important could go on in Ukraine, why are we so woefully unprepared for that, right? There has to be an answer to that question. It has to go somewhere. It has to go somewhere deep. Okay, so if you're doing colonial history, you question the neutrality of knowledge. You look for ways. And one of your methods is you look for ways for the colonized to talk back. Not that they're right, by the way, right? It's not about how one is right and the other is wrong. That would be too simple, right? But rather, when you hear how the colonized talk back, it shakes you a little bit and gets you thinking about how you might do things another way. So I was in Kiev for several days, and I stayed up late watching, because I didn't have anything else to do. Actually, I had a lot of other stuff to do, but I stayed up late watching Ukrainian television because I find it just really ethnographically interesting to soak in the news, in a country where something's going on, and they have ways of talking back. Later in the semester, you're assigned an article about Rashism that I wrote. Rashism, to make it very simple, is a kind of merger of the words Russian and fascism. And Rashism, or with the personal noun rashisti, has become a pretty standard way of referring to Russians who were invading Ukraine. So standard in the sense that the newscasters use it, right? They don't say Russia. They rarely say Russians. They almost never say Russia. They occasionally say the Russian Federation. But usually they usually talk about the rashisti, and they talk about rashism, and when they refer to the country, they're calling it Moskovia. Right? Why would you call it, besides the fact that it sounds sort of cool, why would you call it Moskovia? Go for it.
You're breaking the link between Russia and Kiev Rus.
Yes, you're taking the Rus. So Russia is called Rossiya, right? And which is a name that Russia took in 1721 when the Russian Empire was founded. If you call it Moskovia, you're taking away the historical reference to Rus, and you're also kind of naming it as a smaller country than it is, and you're suggesting that its boundaries might have a certain flexibility. You're also kind of suggesting that when you say Moskovia, right? So the other phrase they use a lot as a euphemism for Russia is aggressor state. Right, they say aggressor state, so which is like neutral. It's the aggressor state, but it's also not neutral because you're suggesting that that state might always be an aggressor and so on. So the next thing that I want to talk about in this notion of geography and deep history is I want us to think a little bit about this late 20th century, early 21st century notion of globalization. And the idea that globalization has made all this kind of careful work that we've done in the first few lectures of this class irrelevant. Because what globalization does, this is the argument, right? What globalization has done is that, to use Thomas Friedman's phrase, it's flattened the world. It's kind of made everything the same everywhere, right? I mean, one of his examples was airport lounges, which frankly I don't think is a great example. Not least because they're really different. I mean, the ones in America are terrible, for example. Like that, I don't think. Okay, I give it as a joke in a different way because, of course, airport lounges is not a representative experience, right? It's not. So the fact that airport lounges might be similar or McDonald's might be similar doesn't really take you very far. But what I'm really going for here is the overall argument that since the end of communism, something like that, since the rise of global trade, the second globalization, things are basically interchangeable. Places are basically becoming more like other places, right? And people are also becoming interchangeable because there are only so many ideas in the world, and we share them all instantly through the internet. Goes the idea. Therefore, we're interchangeable. Right? Maximus and I are interchangeable, Zhenya and Maximus are interchangeable, so it doesn't matter what TF you have, actually. We're all basically interchangeable because we're all sharing ideas all the time, and there are only so many ideas, and we're sharing them instantaneously. So maybe you don't have the idea I have right now, but you can have it instantaneously. So this is the notion, right? So in this utopian view, space doesn't really matter, right? Traveling distances doesn't really matter. Because we're all really kind of all the same place in the same time. Now, the objections to this are pretty clear. One of them is, does information really travel, right? In the world where we are, well over 90% of the supporters of Viktor Orban in Hungary believe that Ukraine is at fault for this war. And why do they think that? They think it because that is their information space. What Russians and Ukrainians think about this war is obviously very different. And it's not just because they're Russians and Ukrainians, it's because they're in different information spaces. You know, what you and your cousin Harry may think about Donald Trump might be very different, and that might not just be because you and your cousin Harry have other differences, it might be because you are in different media spaces. One could argue that what's happened actually is that information space has created more differences, or it's created even firmer boundaries than existed before, because the internet arguably actually travels less well than a newspaper does. If I can print the same newspaper all over the world, as used to be the case, then I may be actually doing better than I'm doing if I'm the Washington Post and I can't get my stuff out in China today, right? So information doesn't really travel, and it may, and can we really go everywhere, right? I mean, this is obviously on my mind because it took me 35 hours to get back from Kiev, but there is a certain cost in going places, and when you take your body certain places, it does have an effect on how you see things. There's a difference between being in a place and seeing it on a screen, right? If you go somewhere and and that involves passports and changing the gauge of a railway, or it involves going through checkpoints, that is different from just clicking on a picture to another picture to another picture, right? It changes the person. By the way, one of the things I found really interesting on the checkpoints it has to do with this overall question of language and where you are and how language suggests where you are. The Ukrainian soldiers generally still speak Russian. That's not really a big secret. But at the checkpoints, if you're at a checkpoint, the way they greet you is they hit you with a really flowery, friendly Ukrainian, right? And as long as you can hit them back with a really flowery, friendly Ukrainian, you're basically through the checkpoint, right? Because there just aren't that many Russians, who can do that. So you show your document, but the language itself is the first checkpoint, which is kind of interesting.